Hello everybody, I hope you're well. If you grew up in the UK during the 2000s, you may be familiar with this, and this. Yes, these are secondhand. Yes, I'm handling these without gloves. I am God's strongest soldier. For those not in the know, these are known as lads mags, British men's magazines featuring all of men's biggest interests: football, cars, new tech, and of course, I'm gonna have to get Kath to censor that already, and we're less than a couple minutes in. Great! The most infamous and most prevalent features of these magazines were the topless women. On every other page, there is a naked woman with her baps out. Top half only though, and that is an important distinction to make, which we will circle back to later. Nuts is probably the most infamous and well known, but we also had Zoo, Front, FHM, and where it all started, Loaded. These magazines haven't been in print for nearly a decade now, and in hindsight, it was pretty shocking that these magazines were not only in print, but they were displayed in most chain supermarkets and at the same height as a child. And what are lads mags without the lads that purchased them? If you're from the UK, you will also be familiar with what a lad is and lads culture. White, middle class, boisterous, loud, drunk, misogynistic, and of course thick with banter, often at the expense of minoritized groups. It's just banter! But what if I told you that these, and the lad as we know him today, actually used to be this and this, and the lads that we knew at university who were popular and very much the status quo, some would argue, had anti-establishment roots. The term lad encompasses most white, middle-class, centre to right-wing boys you went to uni with, but in the 90s, lad was its very own subculture. It's gonna be a big one today. I want to talk about British lads culture and the evolution of said culture as displayed through the evolution of lads mags. I want to talk about the birth of the lads mags, the magazine which started it all, Loaded, the rise of these magazines, the fall, and how these magazines and lads culture in general has shaped young men and women today. We're going to discuss the lads subculture and the women who are a huge part of it, the Ladettes, and the impact that lads culture and especially the devolved lads mags had on women. And of course, we're going to be talking about the lads in lads culture, its relationship to masculinity, and how it influenced what it means to be a man. I have worked so hard on this video. It has truly been my pride and joy, and I can't wait to hear what you guys think. So if you are enjoying this video, please don't forget to give it a like, drop a comment. It really does mean a lot. Plus, I've been handling secondhand lads mags for the past month. That deserves a like in of itself. Into it. When discussing the birth of the lads mags, it helps to set the scene because these magazines weren't just born in the UK, they were born in cool Britannia. In the mid-90s, the UK was having a real cultural moment. British music dominated worldwide charts from bands like Oasis, Blur, and Spice Girls, which became worldwide phenomenons. There was also obviously a really huge house music and rave scene in the UK. We had iconic British designers like Vivienne Westwood and Alexander McQueen, and very importantly, cool Britannia encapsulated a time of political optimism and rare economic growth in the UK. Tony Blair and New Labour won a landslide victory in the 1997 general election after 23 years of Conservative power. And obviously knowing what we know now, that Tony Blair is a war criminal, but at the time in the mid-90s, Tony Blair kicked out a bit of football, and he even invited young celebrities like Oasis, Spice Girls to 10 Downing Street for photo opportunities, and he even threw a party at 10 Downing Street when he was elected, and Noel Gallagher showed up. This was a time where Downing Street parties were associated with cool celebrities and not politicians breaking lockdown regulations. It's quite crazy to me that a time like this did exist, especially as someone who grew up watching a lot of Disney Channel. All I wanted to be was a cool American when I was 10 years old. But anything that British people touched seemed to turn to gold, and Britain and British culture, the music, the fashion, the people, the drinking, the football was cool. Now, despite how dominant this culture of British music, football, partying, and celebrities was, there was a surprising lack of magazines directed at this demographic. When I discuss magazines, we should remember that this was a pre-smartphones time. There were TVs, computers, but they were fixed to a wall. If you wanted some light, on-the-go entertainment, but you didn't want to read a book, magazines were the way to go. And there were plenty of magazines marketed towards women, but not just a surprising lack of magazines marketed towards men, but a real lack of magazines specifically for the everyday man. Popular men's magazines of the time, GQ and Esquire, were very much targeted towards towards middle to upper middle class men. There was also a class divide where middle and upper class men were seen as yuppies, and a lot of regular men and working class men not only didn't identify with these men, but actively wanted to distance themselves from them. When it came to regular men, working class men who enjoyed football, Oasis, house music, and getting drunk and going on a night out on Friday and would roll through to Sunday, which was a lot of young people in the mid-90s, including my parents, and a lot of young men, there were no magazines for them. Enemy music journalist James Brown noticed this gap in the market, and alongside Mick Bunnage and Tim Southwell, in 1994 filled it with Loaded, the magazine for men who should know better. I have one of the early issues here, so let's take a look. A typical Loaded magazine is around 100 pages, whose articles center around music, football, celebrity culture, drinking and partying, and travel. Loaded was pretty infamous for its gonzo journalism. They would send their journalists, who were regular people who readers could really see themselves in, to red carpets, Cannes, sporting events, gigs, trips abroad, and would get them to write all about their antics, booze, sex, drugs, and all in an issue of Loaded. What made Loaded stand out in the magazine market outside of its utilization of gonzo journalism was its style of writing. It was relatable and accessible, chaotic, hedonistic. In a way, it was anti-aspirational. It didn't talk down to its audience. It spoke the language of the everyman because it was written by the everyman for the everyman. Irreverent humor and lads banter and all. Even when interviewing celebrities, Loaded weren't trying to build these people up. They were trying to uncover their embarrassing moments or a cheeky sex story because they knew that's what people actually wanted to read about. As a magazine in the sea of glossy and aspirational magazines in the men's market, Loaded really stood out. It was a countercultural and anti-journalistic establishment. Another important thing to note regarding Loaded's success was at the time, young people were very used to the people around them, their parents, the establishment, mainstream media, politicians, looking down on their favorite pastimes, and that included partying. Loaded was a magazine which not only didn't look down on this lifestyle, a lifestyle which I partake in myself, 365 Party Girl, but actively embraced, encouraged, and glamorized it. Loaded played a key role in the origins of lads culture. In the 90s, lads culture was a subculture in its own right. It was predominantly regular working class men who liked football, Britpop, house music, drinking and partying, and as you can see by even the earliest covers of Loaded, hot women. Despite lads culture in the 90s being anti-establishment to a certain extent, even its origins weren't without its problems. The lad was actually a response to the new man. This was an archetype in the 90s of a metrosexual man who cared about his appearance and was a feminist. The new man was everything a lad loudly claimed he didn't want to be, which, as you can imagine, makes the place of women within lads culture, the Ladettes, a little complicated, but we are going to circle back to this later. Loaded was predicted to be a flop. The staff were only contracted for 3 months, yet by 1995, Loaded became the best-selling men's magazine in the UK. And again, it's really important to keep this in our heads that this magazine would become this and would spur on an entire lads mag genre which looked like this. When it came to the cover stars of Loaded in the 90s, it was a mix of men and women. The first ever Loaded cover star was Gary Oldman. But an interesting origin story of the sexy women spreads is just before the first issue of Loaded was about to be signed off, Rod Stewart's feature got pulled, and the magazine's publisher Alan Lewis replaced his feature with photographs of Elizabeth Hurley in her underwear and some fashion columns to sell more advertising space. Discussing the place of women in the world of Loaded is quite complicated. Loaded employed a lot of women on their team, a lot of female journalists, and a vast majority of these women speak of their time at Loaded very highly. They never felt that they were treated any differently because they were a woman. In fact, they felt quite empowered in the Loaded workplace because they were doing all the same things the male journalists were doing. Loaded fashion journalist Sally Hughes, who began working for the magazine in 1997, tells The Guardian, "Whenever I tell people I worked at Loaded, they ask, were you constantly having your ass pinched or were people trying to get off with you? But it just wasn't like that. It was a brilliantly supportive environment. I wouldn't have progressed at such a pace in a women's magazine because on those titles, people were generally more together." But on the other hand, and a few of them do flag this in the Loaded documentary, yes, women were featured a lot in these magazines, but they nearly always had their clothes off, they were nearly always sexualized and objectified, and as you can imagine, it would only get worse from here. It's a very slippery slope. very soon after its success, Loaded would begin to have some competition. Despite FHM being founded in 1985 and rebranding in 1990, it had a similar target audience to Loaded, especially towards the late 90s and early 2000s when they really began competing each other. And also the lad subculture wasn't as culturally relevant. Both Loaded and FHM were targeting men under 35. FHM looked at Loaded's success and were taking notes. They definitely didn't tap into the working class lads culture, lad banter, or gonzo journalism in the way Loaded did. FHM had more of a reputation of being polished and aspirational and a little more mainstream. It would cover dating, grooming, fitness, humor, celebrity features. FHM and Loaded were in a similar realm, but they were still pretty different. But what both of these magazines had in common were their frequent covers of glamour shoots of hot and scantily clad women. FHM more so. And they really drove up the glamour shoot covers when they got thick into competition with each other. And it was in the thick of this competitive market where publishers and editors began to clock that covers of scantily clad women sold more copies. And in 1997, when FHM outsold Loaded for the first time, the publishers said no more men on the covers. We're going to revisit Loaded later in this video, but when discussing the origins of lads mags, you can't not discuss Loaded. It was the lad mag that started it all, and again, we will revisit later. We will find out what happened, don't worry. But if you do want to know the whole story of Loaded, I highly recommend the BBC documentary Lads, Mags and Mayhem. Throughout this video, I'm going to discuss the women who work for lads mags and the way women as a whole were impacted by the messaging of lads mags, but it's important to lend a moment to the female celebrities who were exploited by these magazines. Model Melinda Messenger says she was sexually harassed during photo shoots. Actress Saran Jones felt she had to do these shoots to start her career. Singer Kylie Minogue complained that GQ airbrushed out her underwear without her consent in her cover shoot. Bandmates Mickey Berenier and Emma Anderson were offered an appearance in Loaded if they stripped down to their bikinis. One of the most egregious and infamous examples of how lads mags exploited the female celebrities who modelled for them is the case of Gail Porter. She was a TV presenter who did a nude shoot for FHM, but what she did not know was that this nude photograph was going to be projected onto the Houses of Parliament to promote FHM's 100 Sexiest Women poll. Gail says to this day that she was not paid a penny for that shoot. First it was Loaded, then FHM began competing with Loaded, and then a plethora of lads mags popped up in the early 2000s. And there is definitely a scale of lads mags, so I'm gonna show you, pay attention class. There is an important distinction to make between lads mags and porn magazines, because people assume that lads mags are porn magazines, but actually lads mags do differ because they feature no down there nudity, no sex. They only seem to feature nudity upwards and maybe a little bit of butt if they were feeling crazy. Featuring butt in the magazine in like the 90s was like pretty rare. The reason why this distinction is important is porn magazines were either hidden on the top shelf or only sold in specialist shops. And if you did want to purchase one, you would probably get ID'd. Meanwhile, lads mags, as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, were stocked in most chain supermarkets, weren't hidden in any degree, and were displayed at children's eye level. And in the early days, I'm sure you didn't get ID'd. But let's get onto our scale of lads mags, shall we? Over here, we have a later issue of the magazine which started it all, Loaded, and we also have Loaded's biggest competition, FHM. I don't have a copy of this, but GQ also had their fingers in the lads mags pie at this time. And fun fact, during this lads mags dominant era, Esquire actually took a stand and banned glamour shoots of models in their magazines, which actually resulted in a 30% sales drop. But I think it's very telling that out of all of these magazines, the only surviving ones are GQ and Esquire. But we have Loaded, we have FHM, and then we get onto the more crass and extreme. And I know that a lot of people are going to look at these magazines and think that they are way more extreme than FHM and Loaded, but without FHM and Loaded, we wouldn't have Nuts, Zoo, or Front. And the reason why Loaded and FHM birthed these magazines was because of this race to the bottom competitive culture that they fostered. These two magazines, especially Nuts, are the most infamous lads mags in the UK. When you think of a lads mag, you think of Nuts. At this point, lads mags have strayed so far from its subcultural and anti-establishment roots. Yes, these magazines still featured male interest mainstays like football, tech, cars, and their target demographic was still the everyman. But most of the content in these magazines were either women in their underwear or women who are topless. And the more desperate these magazines competed for sales, the more nudity they would feature. In 2004, Nuts only featured 2 images of topless women, and in 2012 it was 40. Another offshoot of Ladsmag's culture was page 3. Unfortunately, I don't have a page 3 with me. It is important to note that page 3 wasn't actually a direct product of Ladsmag's culture, because page 3 actually launched in 1970. Page 3 is a feature in the Sun newspaper, which is a very infamous, sensationalist, populist tabloid paper in the UK. But it was and still remains a very mainstream paper, and at its peak was selling over 4 million copies every day. And on the 3rd page, which would be technically the first page that you opened, you know, 1, 2, 3, you would be greeted with a glamour shoot, more often a topless glamour shoot. The Sun actually published their first topless page 3 shoot in 1975, and also the Sun did try to have an equal opportunity moment because they introduced the page 7 fella in 1985, but with very little success. The reason why I bring up page 3 is before we get into the content of these magazines, it's really important to stress how normalized this imagery of women was. The first page of a British mainstream newspaper was of a topless woman. Ladsmags like Nuts and Zoo were visibly displayed in chain supermarkets. And you can't talk about lads culture's crass yet normalized objectification of women without talking about the Soccerettes on Soccer AM, you know if you know. Soccer AM was a British football recap talk show. It aired every Saturday from 1994 until 2023 and had many mainstay features and challenges, one of these being the Soccerettes. Each episode, the presenter would introduce a Soccerette of the week, a young woman wearing either a football shirt or a Soccer AM shirt. It was essentially like a mini pageant. She'd answer a few questions about herself, always asked by a male presenter, to an entirely male crowd. And what the Soccerette feature is now most well known for is when you ask for their age. The older she was, the louder the crowd booed. And the younger she was, especially if she was 18, the crowd would cheer, "Great age!"
How old are you?
20.
And this is the thing, you can look back on the absurdity of this feature and this behavior and honestly laugh. But again, the reason why I'm raising this all is to get across how normalized this treatment of women was. I grew up in the 2000s. I grew up within this very laddish culture. Both my dad and my stepdad are tradies. I would watch Soccer AM with my stepdad every Saturday. I would open the Sun newspaper on my dining table and immediately see a picture of a topless woman. I would go to the supermarket and again, front and center, completely visible to me, stacks of Nuts and Zoo and Loaded, and I was under 10 years old. And of course this was terrible for my developing brain. This is terrible for all of our brains. And I was only one of tens of millions of young girls and women who grew up with this very normalized objectification of women. Tits and lists and I want more birds and less words were the 2 golden rules which governed these magazines. It's alleged, although I couldn't find anything to back this up, so take this with a pinch of salt, this is JT fanfiction, but apparently FHM's 100 Sexiest Women list was born after a study found that men really love lists. So let's put together the 2 things men love the most, lists and women. But staying on the point of tits and lists, when I was reading these magazines myself, what really struck me is that these magazines are just brain rot in a physical form. This was brain rot before brain rot. Lots of bright and attention-grabbing colors, lists, short and punchy sentences, attention-grabbing headlines, loads of, again, really colorful pictures. No article is longer than a couple pages, and the pictures are the focal point of each page, not the text. These magazines are honestly just a few evolutionary steps behind from those TikTok videos which have the Subway surfers on the side and someone like crushing slime in the corner. Another thing which really caught my attention whilst I was reading these magazines is how much you can tell what the beauty standard of the time was. Most of these magazines I have here were published in the 2000s. Not only was the beauty standard very white, and I'm not talking about someone white who has made themselves look racially ambiguous. The beauty standard of the time was white and blonde, and you can see that in these magazines. But also, huge focus on boobs. Like, the ideal body standard of the 2000s was to be really thin, but with really big fake boobs. And there was not much thought given to the butt. And you can tell when you flick through through these magazines. Apart from this issue of Loaded with Harry Hill on the cover actually has an arse's appreciation list, which was rare because this was published in 1997, before its time. Of course, all these lads mags had a humorous tone and were thick with banter throughout, but all of this banter was brutal. And if something was in a quotation mark, no matter what you wrote, it was deemed fair game because it was just a joke. It's just banter. And the humor in these magazines is just shock value humor. It's crass, it's abrasive. I mean, I've read multiple jokes about AIDS in these magazines. People do like to think that there's an irony epidemic amongst Gen Z, but the lads mags take this irony and banter to a completely different level. A dangerous level at that. To further display this, I want us all to play a game, and I want us all to join in. We are going to play, was this written by a lads mag or was this said by a convicted rapist? Filthy talk can be such a turn on for a girl. I bet you want it behind, you dirty whore. The man is supposed to be the man. If he acts the man, the woman won't be domineering. There's nothing quite like a woman standing in the dock accused of murder in a sex game gone wrong. The possibility of murder does bring a certain frisson to the bedroom. Cut your ex's face, then no one will want her. I'm gonna break your heart here, guys, because this was actually said by Danny Dyer in an interview for Zoo magazine in 2010. A girl may like anal sex because it makes her feel incredibly naughty and she likes the feeling like a dirty slut. If this is the case, you can try all sorts of humiliating acts to help her live out her filthy fantasy. Girls ask for it by wearing these mini skirts and hot pants. They're just displaying their body. Whether they realize it or not, they're saying, hey, I've got this beautiful body and it's yours if you want it. Girls love being tied up. It gives them the chance to be the helpless victim. Some girls walk around in their short shorts, showing their body off. It just starts a man thinking that if he can get something like that, what can he do with it? I think girls are like plasticine. If you warm them up, you can do anything you want with them. I'm referencing an article by Miranda A.H. Horvath, Lights On at the End of the Party, Are Lads Mags Mainstreaming Dangerous Sexism?, where she uses experimental studies and analyses derogatory content to investigate whether lads mags normalise sexism, which includes the study where quotes from lads mags are directly put against things said by convicted rapists, and participants could not tell the difference between the two. Again, this is how far this "it's just banter" excuse goes. The content of these magazines being cloaked in humour and irony not only normalised this kind of violent misogyny, but made it palatable, and it spurred on more when these lads mags got into a race to the bottom because they were all competing with each other, publishing not only more nudity, but more edgy and misogynistic banter to try and outsell one another. And millions of men all over the country were reading this, taking it in, and perpetuating it in their own lives, repeating this sentiment and behaviour towards the women they know. When discussing and criticising lads mags, a common retort you will hear, probably from your dad, is, it's just pictures of topless women, it's harmless. But these magazines were so much more than just the pictures, and those were harmful in of themselves. These misogynistic and rape apologist myths, which were printed for millions of people to read, and again, it's all under the guise of banter. And this is why it's so important to clock onto light-hearted misogynistic banter, like what you would have found in early issues of Loaded and FHM, because it's a slippery slope from laddish banter to hypersexualization and lads mags having an overlap with convicted rapists. Towards the late 2000s and early 2010s, lads mags were experiencing declining sales across the board. And there were two driving factors, the first and probably the most obvious being the internet becoming more accessible and the rise of social media, that there was a general decline in print sales across the board. But also, nobody was picking up nuts for a bit of light reading. This was a form of porn consumption. And when internet accessibility increased, so did online porn. Which not only was there a lot more to work with, you now had access to thousands of videos rather than, 50 topless pictures, but most importantly, it was free. Also, another thing to factor in is there were a lot more rules lads mags had to follow that online porn did not. Again, these magazines showed upwards nudity only, plus I'm assuming towards the 2010s you would have to have your ID to purchase one of these magazines, a rule which has only just been implemented in the UK if you want to view explicit pictures and videos online over 15 years later. But it wasn't just the rise of online porn which was disrupting the lads mags industry. As the years tick on, society progresses, and there was beginning to be a lot of uproar and backlash over the sale of these magazines. The Lose the Lads Mags movement was launched in 2012 by feminist organisations UK Feminista and Object. The movement's primary goal was to persuade major retailers, especially supermarkets, to stop stocking lads mags on their shelves. And the Lose the Lads Mags movement actually deployed a very clever tactic to do this. They knew that they wouldn't get that far by objecting the sale of these magazines on moral grounds, because to many people this is just a difference of opinion. Instead, they opted to position their movement through a legal framework. Lads mags being stocked by major retailers not only normalized sexual imagery in public spaces and the objectification of women, but stocking these lads mags actually violated the workers' rights of the female employees of these supermarkets. It sexualized the workplace and created a hostile working environment, violating the 2010 UK Equality Act. This was no longer a matter of a difference of opinion, this was a violation of workplace rights. And in 2013, Co-op, which by the way, very progressive supermarket, they're always the first to like do boycotts or essentially do anything progressive, love you Co-op. They became the first major British supermarket to sell lads mags with opaque covers. And if you were to purchase one of these magazines, you would also have to put the magazine inside of a modesty bag when you left the shop. I think the utilization of shame in the Lose the Lads Mags movement was pivotal in these magazines, going from lads banter to embarrassing. Like, here's a filthy pervert bag for your filthy pervert magazine. Lose the Lads Mags was not alone. No More Page 3 was another campaign to abolish the topless glamour shoots in the Sun newspaper. The Sun stopped publishing Page 3 in 2015, and by 2016, all of the lads mags we've become so familiar with in this video, Nuts, FHM, Zoo, Loaded, ceased printing due to declining sales. But Page 3 didn't go down without like a fight, I guess. In 1986, Labour MP Claire Short, ahead of her time, again, Claire Short, the Co-op, ahead of their time, attempted to introduce legislation which would ban topless images in national newspapers. The Sun ran a Stop Crazy Claire campaign, and in 2004, after Claire expressed her criticisms again, The Sun wrote that Claire was a killjoy and fat and jealous. But both of these movements weren't without their criticisms and pushbacks. Of course, there was a very large male negative response online, and it's so interesting how pushback on social progression often mirrors each other, because the men who were outraged by this movement saw themselves as the real victims, not the women objectified in these magazines who have to see these magazines every day at their work or walk past these magazines whilst on their weekly shop. R. Gill and L. Garcia Favaro gathered over 5,000 online comments left by men about these campaigns. For their paper, Emasculation Nation Has Arrived, Sexism Re-Articulated in Online Responses to the Lose the Lads Mags campaign. Some of the comments argued that these movements were an erosion of men's rights, and that men were under attack, victimized, or demonized in what is depicted as a sinister new gender order. Are we gonna ban Vogue and OK magazine when they have bikini-clad women on them? Or the bodybuilding mags where all those guys wear nothing but those posing pouches? It seems there's one rule for men and one rule for women. Joyless women want Page 3 banned along with everything else men enjoy. Militant lesbians are trying to impose their worldview on our free and open society. They are a menace. Big sister is watching you! Feminists are slowly ruining everything. Soon we will just be a sterile sex slave underclass ruled by our women masters and their ovarian demands. All these women are going on about objectification of the female form. Who do you think is posing in these things? Women! Who is being exploited? Them or the men who buy the mags? And I want to expand more on this last comment, because another argument for the case of lads mags is not only that these models were consenting and getting paid, but many of them enjoyed their work. Maybe some of them even found it empowering. By banning these lads mags, aren't we taking away a woman's choice to pose topless for magazines? These images aren't exploitative, they're actually liberating. How far we've come that women can monetize their sexuality. Anna Tippett names this phenomenon the post-feminist masquerade in their paper Lads Mags and the Post-Feminist Masquerade, in the aftermath of an era of inequality. Tippett argues the construction of sexist representations as celebratory is the post-feminist masquerade in action. It is rebranding sexism as sexiness, objectification as liberation, and exclusionary representations as free choice. The debate was often oversimplified into binary binary questions of exploitation, degradation, and liberation, freedom of choice. Debates that this paper terms the exploitative liberating dichotomy. Post-feminism signifies a micro approach, focusing on sexual agency at the individual level, and thus overlooks the impact on women as a wider social group. And this is what I really want to highlight from Tippett's paper. During the height of these magazines, the 2000s, the New Labour political landscape was a meritocratic and neoliberal one, where a lot of emphasis was placed on individualism, class mobility. Essentially, you could get anywhere in life if you just worked hard enough. And this landscape obviously had an influence over people's views and attitudes. When defending lads mags through the stance of the women who model for them and the way it benefits them, we are looking at this issue solely through an individualistic lens, when what we need to consider is how these magazines, the objectification of women, and the normalization of sexual imagery in public spaces impacts the majority of women, not the minority, and how this distorts men's perception of women as a whole. We can't discuss the fall of lads mags without revisiting the magazine that started it all, Loaded. Loaded ceased printing in 2015, but executive editor Danny Levi relaunched the magazine in 2024 for OG readers who are now living happily at home with their wife and kids, but remain nostalgic for the days of clubbing until 3 a.m, drinking £1 shots with a bedroom covered in posters of half-naked women. And he claimed that this was going to be a safe space for men to oogle at women again. His words, not mine. There was very understandably a lot of criticism of this relaunch. A lot of that criticism actually came from those who worked for Loaded in the 90s. Loaded founder James Brown wrote that the relaunch misses the point. Co-founder Tim Southwell agrees. Nothing in the new Loaded suggests that they have the slightest idea of what Loaded readers really liked. The sexualization of women isn't what made Loaded popular. It definitely helped, but what drew readers to Loaded was the relatable writing and gonzo journalism on subjects normal people were interested in: music, drinking, partying, sex. And Loaded's failure began when it got locked into a lads mag's race to the bottom and leaned into the sexuality too much. Loaded's legacy is a complicated one. When watching the documentary, you can see the founder James Brown get visibly upset when questioned about how Loaded bred a culture of sexism, because in his eyes all the women that worked for Loaded were treated as equals. And I can imagine it's like pretty disturbing that your creation, your baby, the project you were so deeply passionate about, invested in, and proud of, is labeled as sexist. But Loaded represents the origins of this misogynistic culture, and how cheeky banter, especially when you tolerate light-hearted misogynistic banter, can very easily spiral out of control into hypersexualization and violent misogynistic writings and harassment. Loaded may not have looked like FHM or Nuts at the beginning, but they were harshly competing with them by the end, and that will forever be their legacy. As I've mentioned throughout this video, the place of women within the lads mags industry is a complicated one. On the surface, it's easy to dismiss that the only place women had in these magazines was when they were posing half naked for them, and put the question to bed, essentially. But if we cast our minds back to the origins of lads mags, and specifically lads culture, because remember, what we think of lads culture as now, middle class, bellowing drunk and bigoted young men, vastly differs from lads culture of the 90s, which was a working class subculture which encapsulated Britpop and house music, partying, sex, football, among many other things. And within this lads subculture in the 90s, there were the Ladettes, who were in essence the female version of a lad. There was a large emphasis placed on the fact that Ladettes were interested in and could do all of the same things that men did: partying, drinking, watching football, being outspoken, boisterous, cheeky. Some famous Ladettes include TV personality Zoe Ball and Denise Van Outen. It is important to note that Ladette came about in the mid-90s in the thick of the girl power movement, which again specifically highlighted that not only were women capable of doing all the same things that men did, but they wanted to, and they shouldn't be at the end of judgment because of it. I think as a woman who came of age in the 2010s, when you hear about the Ladettes, you do get your back up a little bit, because it is slightly reminiscent of the I'm not like the other girls phenomenon. Were the Ladettes the pick-me's of the 90s? Not necessarily. It's important to remember that women were very harshly judged, and it was even seen as an unacceptable way for a woman to behave if she partied and got drunk and liked football and got rowdy. The Ladettes were subverting gender expectations and were going against the grain. Not necessarily because they wanted to impress men, but because they wanted to be seen as their equals. Many of the women who worked for Loaded during the early days called themselves Ladettes, and as I mentioned earlier, many of them credit their positive experience working for the magazine to the fact that they were treated no differently than their male colleagues. And before we get into the derogatory way Ladettes were framed by the mainstream media and the class dynamics which were at play in this framing, a question which came into my head repeatedly whilst researching for this segment is, what women do we allow to be masculine? Because yes, in the 90s, women drinking beer and partying and being rowdy did subvert gender norms, but I can't help but notice that these iconic Ladettes were all conventionally attractive, feminine women. I can't help but wonder, would this behaviour have been as well accepted if a more masculine presenting woman was doing it? If a butch lesbian was doing it? Or are masculine behaviours only acceptable when a woman you're attracted to is the one doing it? But the high profile Ladettes only represent a tiny microcosm of the Ladettes movement. The beautiful and successful TV personalities that were partying and being cheeky and going shoulder and shoulder to men, of course, were not free from misogynistic criticism or judgment, but working class Ladettes got a really rough ride. The word Ladette was rarely used in a positive way by mainstream media or the tabloid press. In fact, there was even a moral panic about the rise of Ladettes. This was a representation that women were in moral decline, that this was the ugly underbelly of gender equality, and that feminism had gone too far. In typical tabloid scapegoating fashion, Ladettes were blamed for widespread alcoholism, cancer, heart disease, child neglect, crime, and road accidents. Not only were men feeling threatened by the mere possibility that women were capable of having the same interests as them, but a panic ensued of women now entering what were traditionally male-dominated spaces like pubs and clubs. Because of this, despite the fact that women were partaking in all of the same behaviours that men have been doing for decades, partying, having promiscuous sex, being rowdy, watching the football, women were still deeply vilified by the mainstream media because of this. It is interesting and honestly sad that women were the ones who were at the brunt of the lads culture criticism and were the ones who were made to pay for this unruly behaviour. But there's no better case study for society's disdain towards Ladettes than the British reality show Ladette to Lady. This show aired in 2005 for 4 seasons and followed the 5-week transformation of a group of quote-unquote rowdy Ladettes into traditional ladies. Ladette to Lady is yet another British reality show which relies on the shock factor of sharp class juxtapositions for entertainment. Another example of this is Wife Swap UK, where the show would often swap wives from completely different class backgrounds, or the Jeremy Kyle show, where the working class participants sharply juxtaposed the middle class host Jeremy Kyle, who was painted as the voice of reason amongst the rowdy chaos. There is a long history of British reality shows which play into classist tropes. In fact, reality TV, I've said this before on the channel, is the only sector in the entertainment industry where working class people are overrepresented. Jeremy Kyle, Wife Swap, Ladette to Lady, but also Fat Families, Benefit Street, even fictionalized British reality TV shows play into classist tropes. In 2020, a BBC Creative Diversity report revealed often those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds are depicted negatively, fueled by stereotypes, and are seen as the object of ridicule. There are class systems at work in every country. Very few countries are exempt from societal classist attitudes or political policies which have a detrimental impact on working class communities. But in the UK, the reason why these class lines seem so visible in this country is because our class system has been up and running for hundreds and thousands of years, and it's very difficult to break out of that class system. And it's not just that, but with also the creation of the middle class in the 80s, alongside meritocratic messaging being touted by key political figures, meant a lot of class contempt began bubbling under the surface. And it was no longer between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. It was now between the upper class, the middle class, and the working class, with a lot of that class contempt specifically breeding between middle class towards the working class. I feel the class implications in Ladette to Lady are pretty clear, but it's still important to remind ourselves that class and gender is at the heart of the Ladette's tension. Lads culture is a traditionally working class subculture, and something I don't want to do here is paint partying and drinking and rowdiness as an exclusively working class behavior. The demonization of ladettes is yet another example of classy if you're rich, tacky if you're poor, because the middle and upper classes indulge in their very fair share of partying and drinking and substance use and drunk rowdiness, but because they're partying in more upmarket clubs, drinking more expensive alcohol and using more expensive substances, it's perceived very differently than when a working class person or group are doing the exact same thing. Ladette to Lady is yet another British reality show which paints the visibly working class figure as something which needs to be fixed and transformed by the middle or upper class voice of reason. I think what makes this show particularly egregious is not only is being working class almost painted as an unacceptable state of being, but the show is called Ladette to Lady. This is all in the pursuit of femininity. This is all in the pursuit of being a good woman. Again, what we perceive as feminine, what we perceive as acceptable behavior from women is deeply tied in with class. Ways of drinking and speaking which are typically associated but not exclusive to working class women, like regional or northern accents, heavier makeup, fake tan, extensions, by middle and upper classes is seen as not feminine or not the right kind of feminine. But class does not exist in the world of Ladette to Lady, but personal choice does. Guy Redden and Rebecca Brown write of this meritocratic fantasy in their paper From Binging Booze Bird to Gilded Cage, teaching girls gender and class on Ladette to Lady. What transformation shows inherently imply is that the way these people present themselves is a personal choice which can be changed with the right help. Not only is success within this transformation framework the rejection and suppression of any working class behaviors or accents and the internalization of middle class standards of behavior, but also any structural inequalities that being working class brings on are actually painted as individual choices, which with the help of a reality TV makeover can be swiftly abandoned. Again, I want to keep revisiting the political landscape of the time, which was one which had a strong belief in meritocracy and class mobility, and how this show was a product of that landscape. To quote Leanne's research of this paper, although the makeover narrative appears egalitarian, offering opportunity, it naturalizes structural disadvantage as personal failure. It draws a sharp distinction between those who can succeed through self-transformation and those who can't, ultimately legitimating middle-class cultural authority and devaluing working-class subjectivities under the guise of meritocratic fairness. And as I mentioned earlier, this meritocratic political landscape bred a lot of middle-class contempt for the working class. It seems that a lot of people have forgotten about this, but there was a time where tabloid scapegoats weren't immigrants or asylum seekers, it was working class people and people who claimed benefits. But something else I want to highlight from this paper is this notion of middle class cultural authority. As it says in the name, the idea that the middle classes are the ones who decide what is societally and culturally acceptable and what isn't. This is something I think is prevalent in all middle class circles to this day, including young people. I'm going slightly off track, but one example which immediately springs to my mind is after Houghton Festival, which is a British dance music festival, sold out in just 2 hours, there was a lingering consensus that the festival was going to be inundated with not real techno fans, pointing to groups of loud young men wearing tracksuits and having northern accents. And again, I want to make it very clear, I know that not all working class people wear tracksuits and are scousers, but you can't deny that there is a classist element at play here, as the real techno fans are primarily middle class southerners who wear Salomons. And the call is coming from inside the house of that one because I'm a middle class southerner who wears Salomons and listens to techno music. But what I'm not going to do is decide who is a real techno fan and who isn't just by their appearance. But circling back to Ladettes, when middle class people are the ones who hold cultural authority and perpetuate their ideals of what is a right way to act and a right way to present yourself, and also do so on national TV for millions of people to view, this is going to shape what society as a whole deems as acceptable and unacceptable behavior and personhood, which are middle class ideals. Just to round out this segment, although the Ladette began as a positive reclamation, women drinking pints and enjoying the footy and being a bit rowdy was breaking gender norms at the time. But on the other hand, because the basis of the Ladette was the notion that women can do all the same things that men can do, not only did this make me question whether we only allow women to be masculine if they're conventionally attractive, but also it unfortunately didn't address the other forms of misogyny which were pretty rampant within lads culture. Objectification, sexual harassment. The Ladette label could only remain positive for so long and very quickly was adopted by mainstream mainstream media to trigger off a moral panic about feminism going too far and girls going wild. Not only did I notice that women were the ones blamed for any fallout from lads culture rather than the lads, there wasn't a male alternative of ladette to lady, but working class women were particularly scapegoated for partaking in behaviors which most of us do, drinking alcohol, being rowdy and drunk. It was another classic case of classy if you're rich, tacky if you're poor. It's finally time to talk about the boys. In the words of Danny Minogue, oh, the boys! Something I've been revisiting throughout this video is just how much our perception of a lad has changed in the past 30 years. Not without its fault, but the origins of lads culture was fairly anti-establishment and working class compared to the lad of today, which we typically associate as a middle-class bellowing drunk who isn't a stranger to sexual harassment. And repeat after me, is bigoted all in the name of banter. It's just banter! And you can see this swing in the way lads mags have evolved. An early issue of Loaded will show you that this was a magazine for the everyman, the lad, with writings and pictures about football, music, women, sex, partying, and genuinely interesting and creative shoots and spreads. Compare this to a mid-2000s lads mag, even an issue of Loaded itself, which still hits all the general male topics of interest, but with an overt focus on naked women. More birds and less words. And as Kathleen Stock writes for Unheard, these magazines had only ever been the pretext for soft consumption. I've discussed a lot in this video how harmful these magazines were for women, the women who modeled for these magazines, the women who had to stock these magazines at the supermarket, the little girls like myself who were exposed to this kind of normalized nudity from a very young age, all the women who have been victims of normalized sexual harassment and objectification, this normalized culture which these magazines had a very large hand in not only creating but cashing in on. Although it may not appear like this on the surface, these magazines also harmed the men that read them, and even the men that didn't read them, if we're being honest. Lads mags were a fairly mainstream representation of masculinity and masculine identity in British culture. Of course, there were a few ways lads mags went against patriarchal gender constructs. A man should be a breadwinner, a man should be a provider. The Loaded man was hedonistic and self-indulgent. For a lot of men, lads mags were representation. The journalists weren't talking down to their male readers. Most lads mags wouldn't display idealized male bodies. I mean, if only they extended the same grace towards women. And most celebrity interviews would try and uncover some kooky hijinks or an embarrassing sex story. The origins of lads mags were to create a relatable magazine for the everyman, and you can see the echoes of that intention even as these magazines devolved. And this very demise is one of the many ways lads mags harmed their readers. The early issues of Loaded, yes, with their fair amount of objectification, these magazines were still a place for men to go. It was a community in a way, and this community was very slowly taken away. These magazines completely dumbed themselves down, and its shallow replacement is just tits and banter. Banter has repeatedly cropped up in this video, and I want to make it very clear, if it's not obvious already, there's obviously nothing wrong with joking around and having banter with your mates. Even a bit of banter at each other's expense.
Do you like banter?
Yeah, I love banter.
Sick, innit?
But not only is the banter found in a lot of these magazines perpetuate misogyny, racism, homophobia, all under the guise of a joke. I think it was this issue of Zoo that I found multiple instances of blackface. As Dylan Jones argues in Sir Magazine, the cool irony of the 80s was immediately replaced by tabloid irony of the 90s, where as long as you put inverted commas around your insult, it was acceptable. Banter at people's expense isn't exclusively male. I feel like piss-taking is almost baked into British culture and humour. But when the only way you communicate with your friends is via piss-taking banter, and the only way you see male journalists write is piss-taking banter, and the only way you see your male peers talk to each other is piss-taking banter, this doesn't exactly foster a comfortable environment where you feel you can open up to your friends. As Eloise Jones writes for her paper, It's Just Banter, the acceptance and whitewashing of lad culture, male friendship, when built on lad culture, persists as a relationship based in cruelty and fear of emasculation. information. What lads mags also did through the interests that they would write about, football, sex, partying, they were reinforcing their idea of what a man is, what makes someone a man. Because if you're a man who's perusing through the top shelf of lads magazines which are specifically targeted at men, and they're all writing about the same things, football, sex, partying, cars, you're going to internalize that. And if you want to be a good man, if you want to be a masculine man, which a lot of men and boys have been socialized to desire, you are going to pick up these interests. And corporations picked up on this. Discussions about buying your identity is a real hot button topic at the moment, especially in the age of TikTok aesthetics and algorithmic taste making. And people do act like being able to purchase your identity is a solely Gen Z issue, but I am here to argue against that. Daniel K. Cortez and Paloma M. Ling analyzed how the tobacco industry co-opted new lad masculinity in their marketing. Not only did tobacco companies target young men via advertising their products in lads mags, but they chose lads mags over general men's magazines like Esquire because these magazines already glamorized risky behavior like drinking and promiscuous sex. And I want to also, I'm going off script here, but as I was reading these magazines, something I noticed is Nuts and Zoo, they always had features of like injuries and like extreme injuries, again, associating these risky behaviors like literally hurting yourself with masculinity. As I said, these risky behaviors were often painted as inherently masculine. To quote Leanne's research, laddishness was recast as the performance of drinking, smoking, having sex, and spending money, positioning these as essential to being a real man. Masculinity was now a product of consumption. Cortez and Ling analyzed previously secret tobacco industry documents which showed that tobacco companies played a significant role in launching and shaping the editorial direction of many lads mags. To quote Cortez and Ling, the marketing strategies encouraged risky behaviors, a key element of these new lad magazines, which may have benefited the tobacco industry's goals of connecting masculinity with tobacco use. And the even crazier thing about all of this wasn't just a shot in the dark. This marketing worked, and advertising tobacco products in lads mags actually outperformed advertising the same products in more generic men's magazines. Once again, to quote Leanne's research, Queen, the article concludes that tobacco companies not only advertised but actively shaped lad culture by embedding consumerist, risk-taking masculinity in mainstream media, reinforcing a vision of young manhood as fundamentally performative and tied to specific products and dangerous behaviors. This research, honestly, guys, rocked my world. In the mid-2000s, the lad went from an anti-establishment subculture to the new masculine ideal. And the influence that this masculine ideal had over British men, I think really shows in the famous football players of that time. A vast majority of high-profile British football players in the 2000s would regularly be embroiled in tabloid scandals related to cheating on their partners with multiple women, partying and drunken benders, getting into fights in nightclubs, abusing other players on the pitch, racially abusing players on the pitch. Also, all of the top football players in the 2000s were men, which does sharply juxtaposition the famous football players of today, who are not only extremely disciplined in their health, but also very disciplined in their image. There's a lot of women's football representation, and they very rarely, I mean, at least to me anyway, because I'm not really into football, believe it or not, don't seem to be getting into the same scandals that footballers were getting in the 2000s. And this is the thing, you guys know me, there's nothing wrong with getting a little bit loose, being a 365 party girl. In fact, in these technologically isolating times, I actively encourage going on a bender. But this was a lot more than just going clubbing once a week. Through lads mags and the marketing in these magazines, the masculine ideal was now inherently associated with risky behaviors, heavy drinking, aggression, abuse, alongside friendships built on insulting each other, all in the name of banter. Is this a place men really want to be? And is this even good for them? And unfortunately, just because lads mags are no longer in print and the country's top footballers aren't all cheating on their partners, doesn't mean that lads culture hasn't lived on. One of the most commonly reported places where lads culture is most prevalent is in British unis. A study conducted in 2018, The Influence of Magazines on Men, Normalizing and Challenging Young Men's Prejudices with Lads Mags, that is such a mouthful, found at the core of lads culture at British universities was this desire to be hypermasculine. And what behaviors were most commonly associated with this? Excessive drinking, open laddishness, and sexual bravado. This study reported that lads culture would go hand in hand with pack mentality and would rear its ugly head most in men's sports teams and drinking societies. And these group dynamics would actively encourage boisterous and disruptive behavior and sexual harassment. In Neoliberalization and Lads Cultures in Higher Education by Alison Phillips and Isabel Young, 2/3 of participants experienced sexual harassment and violence at university, one participant saying, "Sexism is trivialized so that people who challenge it are made to seem like killjoys or people with no sense of humor. Banter is a get out of jail free card." In conclusion, I cannot believe this video is finally finished. When we think back to the lads mags like Nuts and Zoo, we have a tendency to look at these magazines as a blip in history. Like, what a weird thing that used to exist. I'm so glad that we've moved on from that. But as I've discussed in this video, the magazines may have gone, but the lads culture lives on. What started as an anti-establishment subculture for the everyman who liked partying, football, and women devolved into bigotry, all in the name of banter, as displayed in the evolution of lads mags. Loaded co-founder James Brown insists that his magazine was for everyone and that the women who partook had positive experiences. But sexism can be a slippery slope, and an environment which tolerates sexist banter, objectification, and sexual harassment can very easily spiral into something a lot darker. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. I had so much fun making it. Like, this has actually been my pride and joy. So if you did enjoy it, give it a little bit of love. I'd really appreciate it. The way I'm like, I've got nothing to say now, but I will see you guys for another video, and I don't know what to do with all these magazines now. Like, it actually feels wrong throwing them out, so I actually think I'm gonna keep them. Ugh. And don't forget to check out My Heritage by clicking the link in the description for a 14-day free trial. But thank you guys so much, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye!